Dick Rawlin moved from the shoeshine parlor through the streets of Greenwood, heading towards the courthouse, a path that would soon be etched in history. From prosperity to ashes, the Greenwood district stood as a beacon of black success, until hatred reduced it to rubble. This headline from a bygone era reveals the raw tensions of history. Decades later, the Greenwood district rises again, a testament to our unyielding resilience and enduring legacy.
In the early years of the 20th century, at a time when opportunity was denied to millions simply because of the color of their skin, one place in America quietly defied the rules. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, a neighborhood called the Greenwood district rose against all odds. It was a community built by black hands, black vision, and black determination so successful that people across the country would come to know it by a powerful name, Black Wall Street. Here, black doctors treated patients in modern clinics, black lawyers argued cases in their own offices, black bankers funded dreams, black shop owners served loyal customers, and black newspapers told stories the rest of America refused to print. Money stayed within the community, circulating again and again, turning self-reliance into real prosperity. In an era defined by segregation and discrimination, Greenwood stood as living proof that excellence could thrive even when the system was stacked against it. But success can make some people uncomfortable, especially when it challenges long-held beliefs about who deserves power, wealth, and respect. While Greenwood flourished, resentment quietly grew around it. What began as jealousy soon mixed with fear, rumors, and hatred. And all it took was a single spark to turn that tension into something far darker. Tonight, we are uncovering a story that was buried for decades. A story of achievement, betrayal, and a community that paid a devastating price for daring to succeed. This is not just history, it is a warning, and a lesson that still echoes today. If you value stories that reveal the truth behind the pages of history books, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these stories alive and ensures they are never hidden again. Now, let us go back to Greenwood and see how one of America's greatest success stories became one of its darkest secrets. The prosperity of Greenwood did not exist in isolation. Beyond its borders, Tulsa was a city divided by invisible lines of race and power, where resentment simmered quietly beneath the surface. While Black Wall Street stood as a symbol of achievement and self-determination, it also became a target for suspicion and hostility. In this tense atmosphere, it would not take a crime, or even proof of wrongdoing, to ignite disaster. All it took was a rumor and a young man who had no way to defend himself against it. Dick Rowland was 19 years old, a shoeshiner who worked downtown and lived a modest life in Greenwood. Like many black residents at the time, his daily routine was shaped by segregation. On the morning of May 30th, 1921, he entered the Drexel building to use the only restroom available to black people, located on the top floor. To reach it, he had to take an elevator operated by Sarah Page, a white teenage girl. They had crossed paths before, exchanging nothing more than familiarity born of routine. What happened during that short elevator ride remains unclear, and no official evidence ever established that a crime had taken place. Yet clarity never had a chance to matter. A scream was heard, a misunderstanding was assumed, and within hours, speculation hardened into accusation. A clerk in the building, startled by the noise, concluded the worst and contacted authorities. By the time the story reached the streets of Tulsa, it had already changed form. What may have been an accident, or even nothing at all, was transformed into something far more dangerous by the imagination of a city already primed to believe the worst about a black man. The local press played a decisive role in shaping what came next. Newspapers published dramatic headlines that blurred the line between reporting and provocation, presenting rumor as fact and fear as justification. In an era when many Americans relied on the morning paper as their primary source of truth, these words carried enormous power. They did not simply inform readers. They guided emotions, sharpened anger, and legitimized collective outrage. With each printed line, the story grew more alarming, and the crowd grew more certain that punishment was not only necessary, but urgent. As the accusations spread, it fed into a long and brutal pattern. For generations, similar stories had been used to rationalize violence, especially when economic jealousy and racial anxiety were already present. Greenwood's success had quietly challenged the social order. And now, in the eyes of many, the accusation against Rowland offered an excuse to reassert control. The idea of guilt became inseparable from the color of his skin, and reason was quickly replaced by assumption. By the time Rowland was taken into custody, his fate was no longer in his own hands. Whispers of a public attack moved through the city, growing louder as the day wore on. Outside the courthouse, tension gathered like a storm cloud, charged with anger and anticipation. Inside Greenwood, news traveled just as fast, and fear followed close behind. People understood what accusations like this had meant in the past, and they knew how often justice failed to protect those it claimed to serve. This was the moment when the fragile balance between two communities finally collapsed. A single unproven claim, magnified by sensational reporting and long-standing prejudice, had become the catalyst for something far larger than one young man. It turned a city's hidden resentments into open hostility and transformed rumor into a force capable of reshaping history. What followed would expose how quickly fear can overpower truth and how devastating the consequences can be when it does. As the accusation against Dick Rowland spread through Tulsa, the city reached a critical crossroads. This was the moment when calm leadership and responsible reporting could have slowed the rising panic. But instead, both the local press and public authorities allowed fear to take the lead. What followed was not the result of sudden chaos, but of hesitation, silence, and decisions that quietly encouraged the worst instincts of the crowd. Newspapers, which held enormous influence in 1921, chose language that inflamed emotions rather than clarified facts. Headlines were crafted to provoke outrage, not understanding, and details that might have urged caution were buried beneath dramatic framing. In a city already divided by race and resentment, these words did not simply describe events. They shaped how people felt about them. Readers were guided toward anger, and anger quickly turned into certainty. The absence of restraint in print gave public fear a sense of legitimacy, as if outrage itself were evidence enough. At the same time, city officials faced a test of responsibility. Rumors of mob action were not hidden or subtle. They moved openly through the streets and gathered momentum outside the courthouse. Authorities were aware of the danger, yet their response remained limited and uncertain. Rather than clearly confronting the growing threat, they focused narrowly on holding one prisoner, as if containing a single individual could contain the fury surrounding him. In doing, they underestimated how deeply fear had already taken root in the public mind. The lack of decisive action sent a powerful, unspoken message. When officials failed to firmly challenge false narratives or publicly call for restraint, many interpreted that silence as approval. Crowds continued to gather, growing larger and more agitated with each passing hour. What might have remained rumor became expectation, and expectation hardened into resolve. People arrived not to ask questions, but to witness an outcome they had already decided was justified. Inside Greenwood, the atmosphere grew tense and heavy. News of the growing crowd and the language used in the newspapers reached residents quickly. They recognized the pattern because they had seen it before in other cities and other states. When misinformation goes unchecked, It rarely remains harmless. It gathers force, feeding on fear and turning neighbors into threats. The community understood that waiting quietly for fairness was no guarantee of safety. What made the situation especially dangerous was the way order and disorder began to blur. The presence of law enforcement created the appearance of control, yet the absence of strong leadership allowed the crowd's emotions to dictate the pace of events. Instead of diffusing the situation, each hour of inaction increased tension. Misinformation filled the gaps left by official silence, growing more extreme as it spread. The longer it circulated, the more real it felt to those who believed it. By nightfall, public fear had transformed into something organized. Individuals who arrived out of curiosity now came prepared for confrontation. Conversations gave way to planning, and rumor evolved into a shared sense of purpose. This was no longer a moment driven by confusion alone, but by a collective belief that action was both necessary and justified. The groundwork for violence had been laid not by a single decision, but by a series of failures to speak clearly, act decisively, and protect the truth. In the end, the tragedy was not only that misinformation spread, but that it was allowed to do so without resistance. When those with the power to correct falsehoods remained cautious or silent, fear became the loudest voice in the city. And once fear took control, it carried Tulsa toward a night from which it would never fully recover. As night settled over Tulsa, the tension that had been building throughout the day reached a breaking point. In Greenwood, word spread quickly that a crowd was gathering at the courthouse, and that the young man at the center of the rumors was in serious danger. For many residents, this was not an abstract concern. They understood the meaning of these situations, because history had shown them how often accusations like this ended without fairness or mercy. Waiting passively had rarely offered protection. Among those who felt this urgency most deeply were black veterans of the First World War. These men had worn the uniform of the United States, traveled overseas, and faced danger in the name of democracy. They had learned discipline, coordination, and responsibility, and they believed that the principles they had defended abroad should apply at home as well. When they heard that Dick Rowland might be taken from his cell by force, they did not see themselves as challengers to the law. They saw themselves as guardians of it. Armed with this sense of duty, a small group of veterans made their way toward the courthouse. Their intention was clear and limited: to support the authorities in preventing an unlawful killing. They approached with restraint, offering assistance rather than confrontation, and made it known that they wished to help ensure the young man survived the night. In their minds, this was an act of responsibility, not defiance. They believed that standing visibly for order and restraint might discourage further escalation. But their presence was interpreted very differently by the crowd outside. In a city already flooded with fear and misinformation, the sight of armed black men triggered deep anxieties. Long-standing prejudices transformed caution into suspicion, and suspicion into alarm. Rather than being seen as veterans who had served their country, they were portrayed as a threat to public order. The idea that they might be protecting a life was overshadowed by the fear that they were challenging authority itself. As more people gathered, the atmosphere shifted. Rumors spread that an uprising was underway, despite the absence of any action to support such claims. The veterans' calm resolve was recast as provocation, and their disciplined presence was used as further justification for panic. Each misinterpretation added another layer of tension, tightening the grip of fear on the crowd. What had begun as an effort to prevent injustice was now being framed as a reason for confrontation. Inside Greenwood, concern turned into collective anxiety. News of the growing hostility at the courthouse reached families and business owners who had already spent the day watching events spiral out of control. The veterans' decision to stand guard reflected a wider understanding within the community. When fear goes unchecked, silence can be mistaken for weakness. Yet they also understood how fragile the situation had become, and how quickly intentions could be distorted once they left Greenwood's borders. The standoff outside the courthouse became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. On one side stood men attempting to uphold a basic principle of fairness. On the other, a crowd fueled by rumor and resentment. Between them lay the absence of trust, widened by years of division and reinforced by the events of that day. Authority hesitated. Leadership wavered, and the moment slipped beyond anyone's control. By the time the confrontation reached its peak, the meaning of the veterans' presence had been completely inverted. What was meant as protection was now treated as provocation, and what could have been a turning point toward restraint instead became the final step toward chaos. The misunderstanding was not accidental, but the result of fear overpowering reason, and it set the stage for the violence that would soon follow. Once the fragile standoff at the courthouse collapsed, events moved with terrifying speed. The tension that had built over hours now poured into the streets, and Greenwood became the destination of that release. What followed was not random disorder, but a sustained assault that unfolded block by block, by hour, until an entire community was overwhelmed. The boundary between rumor and reality vanished, replaced by action driven by fear, anger, and a sense of permission that had been quietly granted throughout the day. As crowds moved toward Greenwood, the night sky began to glow with firelight. Homes that had taken years to build were reduced to ash in moments. Businesses that represented generations of effort disappeared behind smoke and embers. Streets once filled with music, conversation, and commerce fell silent except for the crackle of flames and the hurried footsteps of families trying to escape with whatever they could carry. For many, there was no time to gather possessions, no chance to save records, photographs, or proof of what they had achieved. Survival became the only priority. What made the destruction especially devastating was its scale and coordination. The violence did not remain confined to a single street or a brief outburst. It moved methodically across Greenwood, leaving little untouched. Entire blocks were erased, transforming a thriving neighborhood into a landscape of ruins by morning. Residents who fled one area often found themselves forced to run again as the destruction followed them, spreading faster than word could travel. Witnesses later described scenes that felt unreal, as if the normal rules of life had been suspended. Fires burned unchecked, and help never arrived. In some cases, people who attempted to protect their homes were quickly overwhelmed, while others hid wherever they could, hoping the chaos would pass them by. Families were separated in the confusion, unsure if they would ever find one another again. By dawn, thousands were without shelter, standing among the remains of what had once been their world. Accounts from the aftermath reveal that the assault was not limited to the ground. Observers reported aircraft circling overhead, dropping burning materials onto buildings below. These actions intensified the destruction and deepened the sense that Greenwood was under siege rather than experiencing a spontaneous disturbance. The use of such methods underscored how far events had moved from rumor and fear into something far more deliberate. As the hours passed, Greenwood's resistance became impossible. The sheer number of attackers and the scale of the destruction left residents with no realistic way to protect their community. What had once been a place of pride and self-reliance was now defined by displacement and loss. When the fires finally died down, more than 35 blocks lay in ruins, and the human cost was staggering. Lives were lost, families were shattered, and a community that had stood as a symbol of possibility was left broken. Morning light revealed the full extent of the devastation. Where homes, schools, and businesses had stood, only charred foundations remained. Smoke lingered in the air, and the silence that followed felt heavy and unnatural. Survivors searched for loved ones, unsure whether they were safe or gone. Others stood motionless, struggling to comprehend how quickly everything had been taken from them. This was the moment when Greenwood ceased to exist as it had been known. The destruction was not just physical, but emotional and economic, severing people from their livelihoods and their sense of security. What remained was a profound absence, and a question that would echo for generations. How could such a thing happen in plain sight? And how could it be allowed to continue until so much was lost? When the fires finally burned out and the smoke drifted away, Greenwood was left in ruins, but the destruction did not end there. In the days and years that followed, another, quieter injustice took shape. Instead of accountability, there was denial. Instead of rebuilding with support, survivors faced barriers at every turn. What had happened was not openly investigated, publicly mourned, or formally acknowledged. It was pushed aside, minimized, and eventually erased from official memory. Local institutions moved quickly to redefine the tragedy. Language softened what had occurred, reframing devastation as disorder and responsibility as confusion. Records disappeared. Legal cases went nowhere. Insurance claims were rejected, often citing technical language that made rebuilding nearly impossible. Families who had lost homes, businesses, and livelihoods were told to start over on their own, without compensation or recognition of what had been taken from them. The burden of recovery was placed entirely on those who had already lost everything. At the national level, silence became policy. The events in Tulsa were excluded from textbooks, absent from classrooms, and ignored in public discourse. Generations grew up unaware that one of the most prosperous communities in America had been destroyed in a matter of hours. Survivors learned that speaking openly about what they endured brought little comfort and often invited hostility. Many chose silence not because they forgot, but because they understood how unwelcome the truth was. This erasure carried consequences far beyond memory. The economic impact of Greenwood's destruction rippled forward through time, widening gaps in wealth and opportunity that never fully closed. Land lost, businesses were never rebuilt at the same scale. What had once been a self-sustaining community was permanently altered. And the trauma of that loss passed from parents to children, shaping lives in ways that statistics alone cannot capture. For decades, the absence of acknowledgement reinforced a painful message, that some histories were considered disposable. It took persistent efforts by survivors, descendants, and historians to bring Greenwood's story back into public awareness. Even then, recognition came slowly, and justice remained incomplete. Apologies, when offered, arrived long after the damage had already been done. Yet remembering Greenwood matters, not as an exercise in blame, but as a commitment to truth. This story reveals how easily fear can override fairness, how silence can deepen harm, and how the consequences of denial can last for generations. It also honors the resilience of those who endured unimaginable loss and still found ways to rebuild their lives, even when the system offered little support. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story and to witness a chapter of history that was hidden for far too long. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered and shared, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps ensure that the lessons of the past are not erased again, and that the voices once silenced continue to be heard.